I guess one question you might ask, Adam, and this might interest people, and it's a question I ask myself, is that I talk about three kinds of crises, in whatever chapter it is, we kind of walk through them. One of them is internal, one of them is external, the other is financial, right? And the question I often ask is, will we have some sort of financial reckoning begin to break before we have one of the other two, or will they be all kind of together, right? I mean, in other words, if you see what I mean, in other words, if
I see exactly what you mean. So answer this, yeah.
A problem, and I see, as do many other people looking at the economy, I see a higher rate of inflation combined with financial repression as being virtually locked into the cards right now.
Welcome to Thoughtful Money. I'm its founder and your host, Adam Taggart. The fault lines that divide our society are widening. The K-shaped recovery that we've seen since COVID has rewarded asset owners at the expense of everyone else. And millennials and Gen Zers, who are losing faith in being able to achieve a middle-class lifestyle, look with increasing bitterness at the relative prosperity of the boomer generation. These simmering grudges are only getting inflamed further by the divisive rhetoric of November's approaching US presidential election. Are we at risk of a class war, a generational war, an ideological civil war, or a combination of all of these? Or will we find a way to bridge our differences and come together? For perspective, we've got the privilege of speaking today with demographer Neil Howe, co-author of the seminal book, The Fourth Turning, and its sequel, The Fourth Turning is Here. Neil, thanks so much for joining us today.
Great to be here, Adam.
All right, Neil, always wonderful to talk with you. And I got to tell you, you're one of those guys that the longer it goes between your appearances on this show, the louder the clamor from the viewers to say, hey, when is Neil coming back on? So very happy we're going to get a chance to scratch that itch here. I should preface this, I did make the mistake of asking my followers on Twitter what questions they would like me to ask you, and I lost count after like 153. So we're going to get through as many of those as we can here, but it's probably going to be in the single digits, folks, not in the hundreds. To kick things off, Neil, I'm going to ask you a variant of the general, intentionally broad question I like to start these interviews with. What's your current assessment of the state of American society?
Unchanged, from what it was before. I think, like a lot of people, worried not so much about the election, but what comes after the election, right? Mm-hmm. We're going to have enormous collapse of expectations by whoever loses, right? How will they deal with that? And now I think everyone's kind of on their best behavior. We have two very different candidates, but more importantly, they're leading very different social, cultural, political perspectives. I would say so different that they are utterly mutually exclusive, right? And that creates a problem in democracy. As I, tried to point out in my last book, democracy really doesn't work when you have two communities which just don't agree on anything. Mm-hmm. I think I quoted a famous essay by one of my favorite intellectual historians, written back in 1940 on the travails of democracy, who basically said democracy works best when there's really nothing much to talk about. And this, by the way, he wrote this in the wake of fascist and left-wing takeovers of democracies all over the world in the 1930s, right? I mean, this was a decline, as we would say today, Freedom House would say, a decline in the democratic share of the world we're seeing today. But we saw that in the 1930s. And that was his sort of summary, or his analysis of what was going wrong. He said, the problem is democracy does not work when you have two populations that would rather fight than to give up what's essential to them. Then, what difference does it make? Who cares about 51% of the vote? You're not going to submit to that, right? Mm-hmm. In the end, you're not. You might put up with it for a while. So that does worry me because I think we are there in this country. And I'm also worried, that's the internal part, as readers know, that's kind of the internal conflict part, and the external conflict, which we seem to have many of around the world right today. So these two things and how they interact is really the center of my focus, because I do think they feed on each other. That is to say, external opponents take a look at what's happening internally within America. And I think external pressures also influence internal politics here. But so if you want to know, that's what worries me, not so much the election itself, what happens immediately afterward. And I think we're ignoring that right now. I think that's sort of being suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't like to talk about that, right? But I think that's in the back of everyone's mind. Whether it's if Kamala Harris loses, is there going to be another huge resistance, and a big resistance movement, like in France, when the Nazis, drove in. I mean, that's their model, right? The resistance, a new popular front. Or if Donald Trump loses, or will there be serious nullification movements, which ultimately could lead to outright defiance of federal authority? And I think, that's also possible. I think it's also interesting, Adam, not to go on too much about the election, but how much people don't really care too much about the candidates anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Kamala Harris is the first presidential candidate we've had, at least in my lifetime, that never received a single primary vote. But no one really cares. I mean, it's like, and I don't think anyone would have cared if it had been Joe Biden in a coma. Everyone knows that there's a team behind her. They trust that team. It's a reliably blue zone team. You know what I mean? That's what matters. I don't think anyone really cares too much what Kamala Harris thinks. She's going to say whatever she says to sort of bring over the moderates, what few there are left. I may be talking about 6, 7, 8% of voters in the middle, who aren't, completely committed at this point. But that's kind of where we are. And I think similarly on the case of Donald Trump, I know there are a lot of people in the red zone who really don't like him at all, but they'll vote for him anyway, because this is a fear-driven election. It's driven by the fear of the other side taking over. And we've seen that before. And believe me, nothing motivates like fear. I mean, I hate to say it. This is an old truism, but I think we're seeing it here. And that's why, by the way, we're seeing voter participation rates that are at 100-year highs. I mean, whatever else you may think about what's happened to politics over the last 8 years, voter disengagement is no longer one of our problems.
It's interesting. I was just talking with an analyst the other day who was saying, this because it's so tight, this election is really going to be one who can mobilize their base the most successfully here.
I took a bet with someone who said that, well, RFK Jr. is going to get, over X% of the vote in various states. This is several months ago. And I said, are you kidding? All of these pretty candidates are going to get pushed into the gutter. And look, I mean, we've seen that, right? And this is the rule. You're not going to throw away your vote when Armageddon is at hand. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. So I'm sure we will weave the election thread through the rest of this discussion. But since it's something that very clearly is at the forefront of your mind, does this particular set of conditions we have right now, where you said it's a fear-based election, and it's one where the country is we're almost perfectly bifurcated here. I mean, this is a probably going to be a 51% result that determines the election here. Does this remind you of any other periods in American elections that you can draw a parallel to and say, yeah, it's like it was back during this specific election?
Well, to me, I think readers will understand, this is the fourth turning pattern. It is a little bit like what Americans experienced during the 1930s, when we had, the basic choices between fascism and socialism. but that's the way people felt. It was thought that sort of moderate liberal democracy was dead, right, in the depths of the Great Depression. And I think the most obvious parallel is to the 1850s, right, when you had ultimately a third party which sprung up from nowhere, basically stole mostly from the Whigs, some from the Northern Democrats, and rendered political campaigns in America in 1856 and then in 1860 virtually a regional plebiscite on where America was going. And that led directly to secession and civil war, right? I mean, that's the most disturbing parallel.
Okay.
I think you're right. You know what I mean? I mean, that's obviously the most disturbing parallel. And let's not forget that the American Revolution, although we like to think of it as a revolution against Britain, I think that is the way Americans like to think of it. It was in reality a civil war, right? A large share of Americans sided with the
crown,
with the crown, with Parliament, particularly Middle America, particularly the non-English speaking America. It's interesting. Liberal regimes, which definitely, parliamentary run colonies were sort of a liberal regime. It protected rights of people, were particularly gained the loyalty of non-English speaking people because they realized that if America suddenly became this new populous set of English speaking colonies, no one would really respect their rights as much. And they certainly wouldn't respect the rights of former Tories at all, right? Which turned out to be the case. So a large share of the colonists were Tories. They weren't as well organized, and they certainly did not have the cohesive ideology of the Patriots, who quickly dominated. But let's not forget, it was a civil war, and by the way, just like the American Civil War, it also involved promises by the British for emancipation of the slaves that would come over to the Tory side. It was exactly what Abraham Lincoln did. I mean, the governor of Virginia, Governor Dunmore, actually issued the call, and it was issued much later. And you did have a large number of African Americans ultimately leaving with the Tories. Many of them died from smallpox, actually. One thing the Tories did not do, they did not do what George Washington did, was inoculate against smallpox. He did that to his own army. That helped. The British didn't. But look, you do see these parallels. We could go back further, but that sense of polarization and that sense that the country goes one way or the other is typical of these eras.
Okay, and the eras you're talking about are eras of real simmering societal friction that did eventually reach some sort of flashpoint. And of course, that's the hallmark generally of a fourth turning. But that's one of the reasons why everyone's so focused on this fourth turning we're in right now, which is
and I should emphasize they're fourth turnings in our sense, which is a certain kind of generational constellation. A certain period has to pass between the earlier fourth turning. There are other areas which are times of extreme anxiety and instability. The late 1970s was a good example. Late 1960s and then late 1970s during the Awakening was a time of extraordinary tumult in America and disorder, violence. But it was not going to lead to a regime change, right? Because the regime actually was working pretty well. And the solution to the Awakening was to simply relax all the rules of the regime, right? So that is a typical pattern we see. The Awakening is a time when you relax the rules of the regime because the regime is trying to do too much. And so you let people sort of, go their own way. The fourth turning is when you need a new regime with much stronger rules. And that, of course, it's much more likely to involve large-scale conflict.
Great. And we've been talking about the fourth turning, and I realize I probably did a disservice to what are likely a minority of viewers here, but I'm not sure every single viewer knows exactly what we mean when we talk about fourth turning. Can you just give the 60-second elevator pitch of the framework that you use?
Well, it's the idea that modern societies enter eras, generation-long eras in which they fundamentally reorganize themselves in terms of their political and civic constitutions, their infrastructure, really the structure of their outer world community life about once every long human lifetime. And we've seen that obviously in American history, Anglo-American history, really going way back. We see that same pattern more approximately in Western Europe, more recently in Asia, in East Asia, South Asia, and that is part of a broader pattern, actually, of turnings which are distinct social moods which prevail over a generation. 4 of these turnings sort of constitutes a long human life. So we go from the first turning, second turning, third turning, fourth turning, like seasons of a year. And in our most recent secular season, we've moved from the American high, which is strong community, to the awakening, which was attacked community and weakening community, rising individualism.
Right. The me generation.
To the unraveling, which is really the era of the late 80s, 90s, and early 00s. And that's a period of strong individualism. And then now we've entered, since the GFC, the 4th turning, which typically climaxes late. And we still have, another decade to go.
Okay. And when you say climax is late, I kind of think of these turnings, especially the 4th turning, as almost sort of like an exponential curve, at least in terms of change, meaning that the more you go into it, the higher the degree of change is going on around you. So it's not like when you hit the halfway point, you're like, oh, okay, we've seen half of the change. You've probably seen less than a quarter of it so far, correct?
It varies, and it's the order of change within a 4th turning doesn't admit to a lot of easy patterns. And anyone who's read our book will know that there is a sequence of events in a 4th turning. Things have to act in a certain order, right? There is the catalyst. There are the various civic regeneracies along the way. Ultimately, there's the consolidation and the climax and the resolution. But whether some of the most violent moments or most scary moments hit early or late kind of depends upon history. But clearly what happens late is the consolidation, climax, and resolution. That happens late. For instance, during the American Revolution, that was really the Constitutional Convention, the referendum on it, and then the establishment of the new government was actually not a terribly violent period. The violence was actually much earlier during the actual revolution itself. But the total uncertainty about whether America would fall apart or not, or where it was going, was certainly there all the way up till the end, right? And in fact, I'm one of those who believe that the Republic never would have survived had it not been for a new constitution. I think it was on the verge of disintegrating. The 1780s was one of the most horrible decades economically in American history, probably worse than the 1930s. And in the book, I kind of walk people through and describe, how awful it was.
So let me just clarify for folks here then. So it sounds like the writing of the new playbook happens in the 4th turning at the end during resolution. And then the 1st turning kind of takes the football and says, okay, we're going to use this playbook. So the actual creation of the vision of the new system, that's an end of 4th turning event, huh? Right. So we still have a lot of wood to chop then before we get to that.
Well, we do, but it sort of happens quickly, and it all sort of just sets into place because it just seems inevitable. I will say that one of the things that worries me a little bit is that there is so much that has to happen in terms of our political economy, in the sense of, we talk about the composition of public spending, the level of debt. I mean, all of these things, if the entire society moves to a more survivalistic footing, I mean, just imagine the magnitude of changes we have to see and how that's going to impact the economy, how that's going to impact families. And this is something actually we did not see going into earlier fourth turnings, right? Typically, government has been very small. Government always grows by the end of a fourth. That's what happens in emergencies, right? I mean, you have committees of public safety, you have government, someone jumps in to sort of requisition resources, from wherever
and,
they're
and I know
available.
you've said that the populace themselves demand more centralized control during a fourth turning, right?
Oh, yeah. But it becomes obvious once you have an emergency, once the survival of the regime's at stake, either internally or externally, you're gonna mobilize everybody, and you're gonna take wealth from everywhere. You know what I mean? That's kind of the law of nature at that point, right? And so, but what I mean to say is that previously in fourth turnings, the size of government in terms of its material reach was relatively small. I mean, you think of how large the federal government was going into the Great Depression. It was tiny, right? Its budgets, I think the bureaucracies of major corporations in America were much larger than what the federal government was doing. So when it came time to grow, to some extent during the New Deal programs, but obviously much more so during World War II, you didn't have to take away anything. You just had to grow it, right?
Right. And there was an open playing field. Yeah.
Yeah, it was an open playing field. And then, but typically earlier, and the same happened with the Civil War, and typically earlier, one thing you do after the fourth turning is over is you have this huge stream of benefits to all the veterans. So that's been a constant,
Yeah.
And typically those payments to the veterans are just about reaching zero by the time you start going into the next, fourth turning. It's interesting. In fact, I believe only about 2 or 3 years ago, our last Civil War payment ended. I don't know if you're aware of that.
You're kidding me.
Yeah. So it turned out it was a Civil War veteran who very late in his life married a very young woman, right? I mean, you can see how that works, right?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
You're doing that in the 1930s. The last Civil War veterans were dying in the 1930s. Actually, there's a lot of talk about the Civil War, interestingly, and about Lincoln during the New Deal. That was sort of this rising profile of Lincoln again in the 1930s. That's when we built the Lincoln Memorial, for example, right?
Okay.
Right there in the mall. But so you can imagine if someone marrying then, how long that person, you can kind of, right? And that person as a dependent continued. But, yeah.
Wow, it's fascinating.
Believe it or not.
Yeah. Totally orthogonal, but yeah, I think I heard I think President Tyler still has a grandchild who's still alive, something like that. There are some amazing elements like that. All right. So look, let's dive into exactly what you just mentioned there, where you said, hey, it's government's bigger this time, and we're going to have all this change that's going to be forced upon our institutions, and it's going to impact the economy, and it's going to have to redraw the political landscape. And again, we're going to have to get through all that to get to restitution by the time this is over. And if this does take only 10 more years, which sounds like a long time, but is a blink of an eye historically, there's an awful lot that's got to happen between now and then. As you project forward, and I know it's imperfect, and you'll have plenty of times to keep coming back on this program and calling audibles as you see things unfolding on the ground. But what are the things that you most expect to see given the current set of circumstances we have today? And maybe wrapped in that, what are the things that you're most maybe excited, the changes you're most excited about, and the changes that you're most concerned about?
I think the thing I'm most concerned about is the thing that we just talked about, right? And that is, I'm not so much concerned about who is in power, because I think whoever's in power, they will have to act the same way. You know what I mean? In a sudden crisis situation with another great power, a nuclear armed power. I don't care if you're talking about, Iran, North Korea, Russia, you know what I mean? China. I think how a leader will act is relatively constrained. I think that isn't so much the issue, believe it or not. And I think actually the culture will follow in its fourth turning path uh, uh, toward convention and authority. As I mapped out in the book, kind of these cultural changes we always see in a fourth turning, and toward community and toward equality. Those things always happen, right? Authority, convention, equality, community, as well as a new focus on the future. So I think those are the 5 big things I point out. I can't remember. I believe it's chapter, don't quote me on this. I think it's chapter 8.
Okay.
But I go through those things, right? And those always happen. And I actually think, and people will think I'm crazy, but it doesn't entirely matter who the leader is. They have to go in that direction. That's the only way. That's how the turning itself in the social mood just constrains the choices. Leaders are to some extent, made by circumstances, right? And their paths are determined by circumstances. And I've often articulated this thesis before. I don't think anyone would have said that Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, early in their career, anyone would have said that they were going to be great leaders. I mean,
destined for greatness. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And some people you could say Teddy Roosevelt. Yeah, you could have said as a young man, that guy was a dynamo. I mean, he was brilliant. He had full of energy. I mean, that guy was amazing, right? No one would have said that of Franklin Roosevelt. And in fact, people pointedly said they did not think much of him, back when he was in college and as a young man. But he grew into his role, the role that was handed him by history. That's my point. What worries me, Adam, is not that. What worries me is the amount of reconstruction we have to do around public priorities, right? We have a very large public sector today, which is overwhelmingly oriented toward redistributing income to old people. I mean, let's face it. Half of the federal budget, excluding interest payments, 10 years from now, according to the CBO, will be going to Americans age 65 and older.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, a lot of those interest payments will also be going to people age 60. I mean, who holds bonds? I mean,
right, exactly.
Yeah. Right? So but I'm just saying that is the amount of skew. And that means everything else. And talking about defense, you're talking about national parks, Oceanographic Institute, NASA, throw in the cost of all the bureaucracy. All of the rest of it is all in the remaining part of the budget, right? And I don't think people are remotely aware of that, right? And how much when a crisis, you actually have to look at the numbers. We all know what happens in a crisis. It's like suddenly you lose your job. Suddenly you have to look at the number. Where are we spending money? Dear, we got to move. You know what I mean? It's like that. And it's overnight, right? So people don't realize that we're going to have to use huge restructuring of that. I think we're going to move toward a, one size fits all capitated healthcare system. Where I think, the only good thing is that we overspend so massively on healthcare in inefficient, even unhealthy ways, that might actually be something that we could economize on fairly easily, right? But how about cash benefits? How about all the other programs? That's going to be pared back. In order to make room for what? In order to make room, well, first of all, in order maybe to allay the fears of creditors that we'll never be able to pay back our debt, and to be able to afford resources to meet whatever wolf is at our door, right? Do you see what I mean? Whether internal or external, resources will be needed for that. It's all going to hit at the same time. And you understand what worries me, Adam, is that before government was small, it was an open, right? It was, we could just raise without cutting. Today, it's different. We're going to have to cut at the same time, hugely, right? And that's going to be a massive wrenching reorientation of our lives. And it will seem so obvious when it's necessary, right? And you get everyone in Congress could say, well, it's time to break the glass. You know what I mean? They use all those metaphors, for what we have to do, got to do what we have to do. So everyone thinks today it's unthinkable. No, it won't be unthinkable, right?
So I'm so glad you say. So I talk about this a lot, which is how quickly, once it does shift, sentiment can shift. And there are things, as you said, they're just unimaginable when the status quo is raging. They're just topics they're third rail topic. Of course, we could never do that, whatever. And then you get to the crisis, and all of a sudden you're like, all right,
It's obvious. Yeah.
yeah,
You know, it was amazing. In fact, I commented on this at the time, even in 2013. Do you remember the time of the Tea Party and the
sure.
budget crisis and so on? We shut down government for a while, and but it was amazing. There was enough of a crisis atmosphere at that time that plans actually to do a haircut on Social Security were actually there. I mean, they were being considered bipartisan by the, and today, of course, no, they're nowhere in sight, right? And when people tell me, well, it's impossible to imagine a time when people would actually, trust a strong leader again, those times are forever behind. And my response to that, because I get that a lot, what are you
Yeah.
talking about, this fourth turning? We're all going to have to, trust someone to actually make these huge decisions. And then I ask people to recall 6 months after 9/11. Do you know what G.W. Bush's approval rating was in February of 2002? It was like 96%.
I was going to say super high. Yeah.
I mean, it was not, and you think, how did that happen? Well, it's obvious how it happened. You know what I mean? People were scared.
Right. You rally around your leaders. Yeah. I mean, that's why they always sort of accuse unpopular leaders of wanting to start a war just to try to rally the country around them. Yeah.
Yeah. And I actually do talk about that in the book a little bit, the wag the dog, this is sort of the wag the dog. And interesting, the Secretary of State, Seward, under Lincoln, that was his response to the secession of the South. And this was his famous April 1st memorandum that he sent to Lincoln. And Seward was condescending to Lincoln. He thought he should have been the Republican president. He should have been the Republican candidate. But he made a few in politics speeches and so on. Everyone went with Lincoln. But he thought he knew government really well. This Lincoln was a newbie, really didn't understand.
Yeah.
So he wrote this famous April 1st memorandum to Lincoln. And he said, you know what you should do? Start a war with either Britain, France, or Spain. And he gave all the reasons why. And there were actually some things going on in the Caribbean that would give us a casus belli, to start a war. And he said, yeah, well, the war, people were, well, Lincoln understood that this was far too little and too late, to use that. And very tactfully, as Lincoln always was, right? He was a master of tact, just politely never responded to the memo and continued to treat Seward with all courtesy. And Lincoln was a fascinating individual.
Well, I mean, the whole term "team of rivals," was sort of concocted around how he managed, right?
And what it says about Lincoln, about being such a strong person, that he didn't mind that, right? He didn't mind these prima donnas all around him, often threatening to undermine him, but he sort of, he harnessed that energy without ever feeling threatened himself. And I think that's one of his most remarkable traits.
Well, so we've talked about this in the past, which is, I've asked you point blank, like, look, I'm looking at the leaders of these past moments of extreme adversity in America, and there are phenomenal leaders that came out of this, and they constructed the platforms that kind of carried society further. And I'm looking around, and I'm not seeing any great candidates right now. And you said not worried about that. That history has a way of just putting enough pressure in the system that finally it creates the diamonds and they get thrust forward, even if that's not what they're shooting for initially, right? Almost like a Roosevelt, right?
There are. It was interesting when Hoover was, kind of a lame duck. The election had happened. I think that was the last election where we still inaugurated people, in late March, I believe it was, and then we moved toward this much earlier, inauguration.
Yep.
But there was this long period where, Hoover was presiding over this, over this collapsed husk of an economy, and the whole country was holding its breath. I mean, banks were out of business everywhere. Stock market, many weeks it had been completely shut down. And Hoover wanted Roosevelt to sort of join with him to do something, and actually invited Roosevelt and his team into his office. And people have reported on that meeting. And it's fascinating because Hoover gave this huge analysis of the economy right now of the world. And it was, by everyone who was there, it was a masterpiece. I mean, Hoover was a giant, intellectually. I mean, the guy understood the economy, he understood everything that was going on in the world. And apparently, Franklin Roosevelt hadn't the slightest clue of what he was talking about, and basically just said a few kind of mild pleasantries, and basically, suggested that some of his aides reply. And however, Roosevelt's political instinct was correct, which is obviously not to join with him and collaborate with him in any way.
Don't get tainted at all
I'm
by
not
this
going to
think on
do
this
anything.
guy.
And that is the pattern. Lincoln did the same with Buchanan. Buchanan wanted Lincoln to sort of help him in these last gasping moments when the South was seceding and so on. And Lincoln basically said, no, I want everything the bad that happens to be on your watch.
Yeah. All right. So, and I take some comfort in that.
And I might just say, Adam, just to bring this up to date, there might have been a little bit of that in the Republicans' refusal to go along with a bipartisan immigration reform bill, earlier this year. I think it was the same instinct. This basically was Trump saying, you know what? You've sat on your hands all your administration about doing anything about the border. Now you want our party to provide you with cover. No, thank you. We'll wait until after the election. And interestingly enough, now that, now that you have the Kamala Harris presidency, Joe Biden is saying, well, we put into these new Border Patrol procedures, which have brought down illegal entries 50% in July. And there's the headlines now, right? And I think that the Republicans are saying, this is what we always said. They did have it within their means to do this by regulatory, do this by executive order. They didn't need new legislation.
No, I'm sure that that's the case, and I think Republicans are even further consternated right now, because it seems like from some recent campaign ads that the Harris campaign has put out that they are now sort of at least seemingly portraying that Kamala is for rebuilding the wall and basically trying to absorb some of these Republican that have been key differentiators, right?
She doesn't want to tax tips. She doesn't want to, whatever Trump does, she's saying, yeah, me too.
Yeah, which may be, maybe a pretty good strategy, which is like, let's just try to chip away at all the biggest points of difference, and then I'll win on some other dimension.
Yeah, I think it's what we started by talking about. There's kind of an esoteric and exoteric strategy, right? The esoteric is to everyone who are committed followers, on the left, and I think same by the way for Trump on the right. Who I really am. How I'm going to really govern. But for now, we're going to do. This is what I'm going to say. And I think there's that. One thing.
Your point earlier too. Nobody's going to shift from Team Blue.
Exactly. That's my point. So it's like kabuki theater. No one really cares too much what they're saying right now, right? What you're getting. But I do think what bothers me, to come back again to my issue of kind of the fiscal revolution that we're going to face.
And let's dig into the implications of it.
Yeah, because what everyone is saying is, I'm not going to tax tips. First of all, what's the rationale for that? So then I'm going to get my pay and tips. So we're all going to start getting, what's the incentive of that? We're going to all get half of our pay in tips. I mean, does anyone think this through a little bit? You know what I mean, Adam? It's kind of like, does anyone think about what they're saying, right? And you're not going to tax Social Security benefits? I mean, are you kidding? This is basically, it's basically the one stream of payment that that just goes to wealthier old people. I mean, what are you gaining by that? And I sometimes wonder, when you're constantly giving things, what are you paying for them with? Well, you're increasing the deficit, right, Adam? So
Right.
basically what you're doing is, and the same thing, by the way, I did a big piece recently on, cat ladies and the fertility rate, and really looking at JD Vance. Well, I'm a demographer, so I like to think a lot about demography and about fertility rates and so on. And I thought a lot of the arguments that JD Vance makes are good ones. I mean, it is true the Republican Party is naturally the party of higher birth rates, and we see that in the data. No matter how you divide up the population, no matter what subgroup you're looking at by age or anything else, Republicans tend to have more kids. They tend to be less likely to be single. Republicans care more about family life and about, policies that foster having kids and forming families. What he doesn't quite get is how massively you need to spend in order to move the needle on fertility. We see that in Hungary. We see that in Poland. You're going to talk about several points of GDP. Why? Because one of the reasons why people have kids historically, traditionally, is to take care of them in old age. But what we've done in all of the high income societies around the world with pay-as-you-go social insurance systems is we basically subsidize the cost of growing old, right? But leave entirely private the cost of raising young people. So if you don't have any kids, everyone else's kids are going to support you. Well, what does that mean, right? And so you need to have a subsidy to raising kids that's as strong as the subsidy to grow old. You see what I'm talking about? This is why you're going to need $5,000 or maybe even $750 per child every year to move the needle on this, right? If you are not going to pare back on the generosity of the subsidies to seniors, or pare back on the deficit, which is also a payment to old people, because you're basically telling old people, you're not going to have to bear higher taxes now. Someone else's kids are going to bear them, right? So if you're not going to do that, if you're simply going to add on by doing new programs, they're going to have to be big programs. But in addition, you're going to have to actually fund them. And this is what I don't see on either side, right? Harris or Trump. Who's going to fund any of these initiatives, these tax cuts and this stuff? We're already running 5 to 6% of GDP deficit when GDP is actually above its potential. I mean, look at the CBO on that. We're at the peak of the business cycle now, and we're running these enormous deficits. In what world is this rational? But no one calls on it, right? No, neither side it gets called on this.
Not yet, but it seems like we are barreling towards, a moment of reckoning with this, right? Where at some point the funds are not going to be there, or creditors aren't going to want to buy the debt or whatever, where we're just not going to be able to keep doing this. Because I love how you put it, and I talk about all these issues all the time here on this channel, but deficit spending, we're basically, how are we funding things if we deficit spend? We're stealing from the future, right?
If you do, for instance, do this bonus to baby, Kamala Harris now. Kamala Harris does the same thing, right? So now she's in favor of a $6,000 baby bonus, a one-time bonus, right, for babies. And I'm just thinking, if you're going to do that through deficit spending, then send a note along with the payment to the parent and said, dear parent, thank your kids and treat them very well, because they're going to have to pay all this back plus interest, right? That's what we should include in the note. And then have the parents, and then tell them to go out and have a good time on that check.
Right. Well, and and we're not even doing that yet. And we still, I think, have a solvency crisis, right? Because we're stealing from the future. And your point, we're largely giving it to the aged, right? And we have, you know, an increasing percentage of the population that is struggling and suffering because they're left over to basically be the ones to try to keep the engine going from here, which makes total sense why people aren't forming families, right? And if you want the current economic model to continue, it actually is dependent upon a growing population of working age people, right? So we're heading in the wrong direction on that. So we actually do need to solve the population growth issue, the family formation issue, if we want to keep the model we have. I think you would say, look, long before we even get to that point, the model we have is probably going to break anyways from the solvency issues that we have going on here. So as we get into this fourth turning, you know, what are the economic shoes that you feel you can predict with some degree of confidence are going to drop? I know one of the ones we've talked about in the past has been, you know, you mentioned equality as one of the key elements of a fourth turning. You know, presumably there's going to be some sort of wealth redistribution that goes on here. I don't think I don't think you think we're going to get out of this without some sort of attempt to even the wealth disparity.
So you have to understand why equality becomes a priority. And the reason it becomes a priority is when the regime is in danger and requires everyone to help save it, right? You need to give everyone an incentive
Yeah,
to be on board, right? So that's why you need to do it. Now, you can take wealth from the wealthy, but from the non-wealthy, you're going to need them to serve, right? You're going to require sacrifices from them. And the only way you can recapture their loyalty, or, is to give them a reason to feel that they're part of the new regime. It's not altruism. You see what I mean, Adam? It's
survival.
Survival. This is why FDR, at the height of the World War II, started his kind of New Deal for the middle class. I mean, he sort of went, he talked about this new GI Bill of Rights, which was basically this incredible new sort of socialization of life for the returning veterans, right? I mean, you're doing all of this dying and sacrificing, conquering half the world to save the world from fascism. This is what we're going to do for you, right? We're going to pay for your education, pay for your vocational schooling, pay for your homes. We're going to build highways for you. We're going to, I mean, all of this stuff, right? And it's all going to be for you. We're going to focus on the future because we know that that's what you care about. FDR didn't care about the people receiving Social Security, which, by the way, with enormous inflation during World War II, was not COLA. Remember that?
Yeah.
There was no COLA on Social Security back then. So, and not a lot of people were receiving it yet. But my point is that no one cared about the older people at that point. FDR was firmly focused on the rising generation of young adults.
And do you see that the pendulum swinging in that direction?
But it's going to have to. It's going to have to, because you're going to need to motivate them to come to the defense of the regime, right? That's what you need. You need those people to be incentivized, to be enthusiastic, to see that this is the key to our future. That's when you come down to motivating large numbers of people to truly throwing their lives into something, you need to give them reasons to do it.
Okay, so that's going to be a very big change from the status quo, and again, maybe a very necessary one to achieve the sort of sustainability and renewal that we need going forward from here. We are we're
I mean, I guess one question you might ask, Adam, and this might interest people, and it's a question I ask myself, is that I talk about three kinds of crises, in whatever chapter it is, we kind of walk through them. One of them is internal, one of them is external, the other is financial, right? And the question I often ask myself is, will we have some sort of financial reckoning begin to break before we have one of the other two, or will they be all kind of together, right? I mean, in other words, if you see what I mean, in other words, if
I see
debt
exactly what you
and
mean.
interest
So
rates
answer this.
become
Yeah.
a problem. And I see, as do many other people looking at the economy, I see a higher rate of inflation combined with financial repression as being virtually locked into the cards right now, right? Basically, if you inflate the economy, right, you deflate the claims the creditors have, and then you basically require a lot of people to hold bonds. You can do that. You can require banks, you can require a lot of pension funds, right, to just hold them. France already does this. Japan already does. A lot of other countries already do this. We start doing that in this country. And those, you'll eat those negative returns.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important that people understand this process, right? If we start having to run, imagine if we just suddenly enter another serious recession and maybe deficits start going up to 10% again. Maybe you compound that with international difficulties. Maybe a run on the dollar. What if the exchange rate starts? In other words, what are we going to do at that point? You need to start reassuring people that bonds are a good investment again. And one of the ways you can do that is, the Fed can start buying a lot of bonds, obviously, which we'll have to do. But the other thing is you got to force a lot of people to keep holding them. And we can do that here domestically.
Let me flag this because you're taking this exactly where I wanted to go. And one of the questions I wanted to insert in here is the playbook to date has been money printing. We're going to borrow, we're going to print money to do it. And the casualty to that is the purchasing power of the currency, right? If we get into the situation you're talking about, do you think that we're going to do even more of that? Right? Or do you think to make people trust the US and trust the bond market more, will we actually let bondholders start taking losses? Will we let defaults happen in the system the way that it's just anathema to us right now?
I think what we will do is if we suddenly need to spend a lot more money publicly, right? We will do all of the above.
You'll do whatever it takes. Okay.
We will do whatever it takes. And it's interesting. If you look at the typical pattern of governments in fourth earnings, it's always a combination of three things, right? How do they fund this extraordinary mobilization of the public, right? For public purposes. I mean, it's the explosion of public spending and marshaling of resources for some huge public purpose. It's usually three things, and it's often about equally, they raise taxes, they sell a lot of debt, and they use inflation. And it's all three of those, right? It was certainly all three of those for the North during the Civil War. For the Confederacy, it was almost all inflation, unfortunately. They weren't able to sell a lot of debt. They just printed a lot of money. I would say for the Confederacy, it was probably 80% inflation, not much tax raising, not much debt sales. But again, for World War II, it was a huge amount of debt sold. It was tax raising, clearly, and also just wage and price controls and various regulatory ways of just pushing people away from spending, right? And then it was inflation, and it was inflation combined with financial repression, which forced people to have interest rates were far, people were receiving interest on federal debt far below inflation, and that was the Treasury Fed Accord, which lasted all the way up until late 1951, when famously William McChesney Martin, who was Truman's guy at Treasury, came over to Fed, and Truman never forgave him, right, for declaring independence of the Fed. And basically the Fed saying, no, wait a minute, to avert inflation, we need to start hiking interest rates. Right. I'm sorry, Mr. President. And Truman never forgave that SOB, as he later said. Even very late, long after his retirement, Truman never forgave him, and I think blamed him for not getting elected again. Look, I think William McChesney Martin was a great Fed chairman. He was chairman, by the way, almost 20 years, right? He was chairman from 1951 all the way until 1970. And by the way, with all of the accolades on the Maestro, back in 1996, Greenspan for, enabling a soft landing, right? William McChesney Martin is the only one who did it after a yield curve inversion. There was no yield curve inversion in 1994 and 1995, right? And there were almost no recession indicators flashing red back then. I actually have a show, which I do once a month on sort of the monthly economic indicators. But in 1966, we actually had a yield curve inversion. William McChesney Martin avoided a recession. And you go back and look, yield curve inversions have predicted 11 out of the last 10 recessions. That 11th, that false positive, was 1966, and that was Martin's doing. So,
all right, we'll see if Powell can pull off the same, but I know there's a lot of doubters out there. So let's get down to brass tacks here. So there's going to be a lot of upheaval economically, politically, socially, that is going to, it's going to require a lot of pain for the current power structure to consider the type of really big measures that you're talking about here. And we should expect an explosion of public spending to come out of this, where we're going to see higher taxes, a lot more debt issues, inflation and financial repression, like you said. So for the people who have gotten sufficiently freaked out by hearing you predict all that, Neil, like practically and tactically, what are some of the ways people should look to this future and say, how can I navigate this without just getting financially destroyed along the way?
Well, two obvious rules. First up, I think one is, avoid long-term nominally denominated assets. T-bill and chill is fine. If you're investing in short-term treasury assets, I think at least for now, those are fairly safe. And probably a good choice, given the rate of return. It'll be different a month from now. It'll be going down fast. I've been interested to see that the dot plots from the FOMC board predicts only a 100 basis point decline by the end of next year, whereas the market's predicting over a 200 basis point.
Over 200, yeah.
Much steeper decline. So you can see how much faith the markets have in this soft land. Yeah. But seriously, I think for now that's safe. But I think long term, that's very problematic. Now, it may be risky, but obviously, if the economy is going down, it's probably not a terrible bet to invest in long-term debt, but it's risky. But I think as a medium or long-term proposition, it's a terrible idea because these are exactly the assets that are going to have to lose. And when I say they're going to have to lose, I just mean arithmetically, right? This is where you have to get back some of the value. This is the only way you can get back from under that publicly held debt mountain that's hanging over the federal government right now. So, and I think that will be necessary even if we don't have, in other words, even if we didn't face a coming recession or another public emergency. That's what really worries me. I think we're so out of whack on the magnitudes right now that I think that has, by the way, always been a good decision in a fourth turning, not to invest in a nominally denominated bond. And of course, back then, that's the only type we ever had. Today, you have tips, right? I mean, you do have these inflation adjusted options. Even those might not be good because, the real interest rate will also probably go up.
Would be higher, probably, yeah.
And I would also think about staying away from investments with a lot of counterparty risk. Some of the complex ETFs that are out there. Some of the, look, they're all kinds of put and call options and weird. There's these weird ETFs now that are these ones that are semi-transparent and they invest in real assets. I mean, just bizarre stuff. And I'm just thinking, know where your money is. That's the other thing. Know where your money's going. Investing in an individual ticker, that's pretty safe. Investing in the S&P 500 as a whole, well, that's getting riskier. And this is something we haven't talked about, Adam, but this is something I've written about and others are writing about. And that's the whole problem of passive investing, right? The herd impact of passive investing. This also worries me. And I think that's, if you look at millennials, which are, by the way, investing at a very high rate, right? They are scared about their future. And now that 401ks are opt out rather than opt in, the millennials aren't thinking about it. They automatically are putting their money in these 401ks. Where does their money go? Overwhelmingly into target date funds, right? These are the ones being offered by, BlackRock and State Street and all that, right? And it's almost all into equities. And they're all into these equity indexes and ETFs. Yeah. And so there's
those ETFs are heavily skewed to a small number of stocks too. The representation of the Mag 7 in those equity ETFs is it's outsized relative to the remaining 493 stocks in the S&P.
Well, yeah,
so if 7 stocks goes down, it ripples through.
And as the larger they are, the bigger the share it is. And also these large firms, these large firms in terms of market cap are naturally included in the most ETFs. So if you have people investing a lot of ETFs, they overlap with all the large, the large market cap firms, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a systemic risk, which is if those few firms get in trouble, everybody goes down with it. Yeah.
Everyone goes down. And there is a kind of wisdom in millennials. And I think they understand accurately where we are in the politics of this country, right? Gen Xers, when they invested, they were natural contrarians. Gen Xers figured, my generation, we're all going to be wasted. None of us are going to get anywhere. I'm going to get ahead by being an exception. So I'm going to go into this very weird, actively managed fund. I'm going to go way off here somewhere, and I'm going to be the winner. All of my peers are losers, right? And I think that many of them have been very successful that way. I think the millennial attitude is very different. Their attitude is, if I invest in some small stock that's somewhere in the Russell 2000, well, if that stock goes down, the Fed won't even care. They don't care. But if Apple goes down, if NVIDIA goes down, imagine NVIDIA goes down by 50%, Jerome Powell will have an emergency meeting, right? He's got my back. And I think millennials also recognize, if we all invest together, if we all go down together, government's going to have to bail us all out.
We'll get
rescued. What other choice will they have? And I think they're absolutely right. The Xer impulse is, I'm going to take my life craft and I'm going to swim desperately away from everyone else. Yeah. The millennial idea is, let's just tie all of our life craft together. And if we all rise, great, because we won't envy each other. We'll be rising at the same rate. And if we all go down, our moms and dads will have to bail us out, right? I think that's the way it works.
Okay.
And I'm not entirely sure they're wrong. I think they have a pretty good sense of where we are post 2008, post COVID liquefication of the economy by the Fed. I think they have a pretty good instinct about where our policies are at this point.
Well, and that's why I asked the question is do you expect more of the bailout playbook to continue, or at some point, because of tightening pressures, that the government's going to be forced to let parts of the economy that it otherwise would have bailed out have to sink or swim going forward? Sounds like you think still going to be the bailout playbook.
It's still going to be the bailout playbook on a vaster scale than ever before, but in suddenly an environment of constrained resources, it will be top-down designation of who wins and who loses, right? You see what I mean? It'll be saying, okay, you guys here, you're going to get a haircut. You guys will stay safe, right? I mean, that's how it's going to work. Think about, again, what happens in a crisis. I mean, think about World War II and who suffered, who didn't, how the losses were allocated. The problem is this: we get caught up into thinking so much about financial flows, we forget just about the real economy. If you're suddenly taking a large share of the population and you're forcing them to do some massive task, like, I don't know, fight a war or do something like that, right? Where are you going to get, who's suddenly those people aren't going to be producing, right? Everyone's going to be employed. Employment's not going to be your problem, right? It certainly wasn't during the war. But suddenly you're going to have just a lot less resources being produced. How are you going to allocate that loss? It's very simple arithmetic, right? You're just going to have to say, well, all of you people in the Army, we're going to pay you a certain amount. We're going to promise you a lot after the war, so you won't feel too bad, right? And, we're going to reshuffle things like that. I think that's the way we have to think. Think more about the real economy, how you have to relocate real economic resources, and then the financial resources will simply be a reflection of that top-down reallocation.
Okay, got it. And so I'm going to have you back on in the future to really talk about even more detail on who you think the haves are going to be in that scenario, and who you think the have-nots are increasingly going to be. But we don't have enough time in this interview, and I do want to go back to your thoughts on how to not become collateral damage in this, because you gave us some very good advice on what to avoid. I'm just curious what makes your list of things to consider here. And I'll just throw out there, I would imagine, given what you see coming, seeing things whose intrinsic value can't be inflated away, hard assets, et cetera, maybe a Bitcoin. Don't know your thoughts on Bitcoin, but maybe those might be appealing. But if there's other assets you like even better, please, let's hear them.
Well, whether or not Bitcoin is a hard asset, that's up to everyone's, that's an individual choice, right? But yes, commodities, precious metals, those kinds of things. I would say that the real side of the economy, and by real here, I mean manufacturing and materials, right? I'd say materials is probably the unsexiest sector of the S&P 500, and yet, what do fourth turnings always feature? They always feature reconstruction of our outer world, right? Building of things. And what is the aspect of our society which has been most neglected, since the GI generation was in its prime? It's the building of communities, right? I mean, look at the infrastructure we drive on. A lot of our airports, I mean, they're oldest in the world. They're all crumbling. They're falling to pieces. Boomers never invested in that stuff. They hated it. Boomers' idea of civic revival was to tear down dams, basically tear down stuff. So we've never done that. But the rebuilding and reimagining of a new public infrastructure is going to be huge. And I think that's going to involve the whole, by real, I mean sort of concrete side of our economy. And one thing we've already seen, for example, is you've looked at some of the global defense ETFs in manufacturing lately. They've done pretty well, right? And I guarantee you they're going to be doing well in the future, because the wargaming scenarios you've seen for an explosion of a conflict over, I don't know, the Spratly Islands or Taiwan or anything in the Western Pacific or anything like that. What they wargaming scenarios typically show is that after about 8 or 9 days, America runs out of missiles. We ran out of munitions. And we are nowhere near producing armaments, right? Which is simple. And I'm not talking about new technologies. I'm not talking about drone swarms or anything like that. I'm just saying simply having the munitions to actually conduct a conflict, given our current, our current assortment of hardware out there, we ran out. And that alone will require, that may actually require, executive order, actually emergency expansion of, Northrop Grumman and Raytheon, a lot of these, companies that traditionally produce this stuff. We have so pared back and so economized on the production of this stuff during the long post-Cold War to Cold War period that we're going to have to do an enormous expansion here. Every country in the high income world is spending more on defense now. I mean, you know, Japan, South Korea, almost every country in Europe. I mean, everyone's ramping up now. And so bottlenecks are being hit everywhere. I don't know about you, Adam. I don't think that's going to be reversed anytime, you know, this year, next.
Sadly, I can't disagree with you there. All right. Well, look, Neil, I'm looking at the time. I would love to continue this for another hour or two. I did promise you I'd be respectful of your time. I know there's going to be howls of disappointment from the viewers here. Two last questions for you as we wrap up. First one, very important for folks that would like to follow you and your work. They've really enjoyed this conversation. They don't want to wait until your next interview on this channel. They want to get more Neil Howe in the interim. Besides buying your books, where should they go?
They can go to Substack. We run a site called Demography Unplugged. And yeah, Demography Unplugged. Just go there. And we do a weekly podcast. And I also do a monthly All About the Indicators, which is basically looking at the macroeconomy of the US. Every month we go through all of the indicators and kind of go through a dashboard of kind of where we now stand. And also have a number of print pieces that come out on various issues, social mood, demography, public policy, and the rest.
Also fantastic. And it's a fantastic Substack, folks. Neil, I will, when I edit this, I'll put an overlay of your Substack URL there so folks know exactly where to go. Folks, I'll have a link down below the video as well. I've got one more question for you. I'm going to lie. I'm going to squeeze one more, and then I meant to ask you earlier. Real quick, given that you do your monthly deep dive and all the indicators and whatnot, what's your level when you look at the markets today? Are you worried about a downward repricing in the markets for all the reasons we talked about, or do you think the markets are going to potentially do pretty okay from here?
You know, I think there's a lot of buy the dip now in the markets, right? I just think there's both because of the Powell put, sort of the ultimate, you know, floor. I think that what worries me is that we live at a time when the market goes down, everyone expects it to be bought back up again. But there comes a time which will go down, you know, and it'll break through a number of support levels. And then that will kind of be in a new world, right? I do worry, this is more of a cyclical observation, but we've been through this whole drama before, right? The inverted yield curve. I mean, all of these long-term indicators going red, then the medium-term indicators. Now we see it happening in employment, and then the Fed starts to cut, right? And the Fed always starts to cut before the next recession. And by the way, typically the yield curve uninverts just before the next recession. In other words, I look at this, and by the way, when you go into the next recession, the markets always go down, right? I mean, you always have a huge fall in the market. So I look at this as sort of, I don't know about you, Adam. I just see, I've seen this exact thing before, right? The Fed always cuts right before the next recession starts. And I think you're seeing that. And by the way, the fact that the CME futures is looking at 225 basis point cut, you know, by the end of 2025, not just the 100 points that the FOMC is looking at, I think is to the extent to which the markets kind of understand this game as well.
Okay. One of the things that I've said to people is when you look at the historical data, it does seem very much like this is a cycle that has repeated pretty much in almost every recession in living memory. So if you expect it's not going to happen this time, you better have a really compelling reason why not. And I get the sense that you're not seeing a really compelling reason that it should truly be different this time.
No, one big event last week that certainly reported on were these enormous revisions in the
payrolls.
Yes, yeah, the non-farm payroll. And by the way, unlike what some people are saying, it doesn't always get revised negatively. And if you take a look at our presentation, I go back and look at the last 20 years of revisions, and it's absolutely counter-cyclical, right? We always go into the negative revisions right before a recession. we always positively revise coming out of the recession. In other words, the birth-death model that the CES employs is totally countercyclical. And if you go onto their site, they admit as much. They say that. They said, yeah, we understand this is not without bias. If you want an unbiased estimator, a lot more variance, but unbiased, take a look at the CPS employment. And that has been moribund, zero growth over the last year in current population survey employment. So that's where I am on that.
Okay. I just, like I said, I could keep going for hours with you, Neil, but here's the very last question. So like I said, I asked my audience, folks, I've tried to integrate as many questions as I could here, but here's one last one for you. Neil is the only person that appears to be immune from anxiety when discussing and analyzing the fourth turning. What's his secret to remaining so objective and clinical in the presence of such ominous data, which he knows too well? Does he realize that he may become our great champion?
No, sorry, not in the running for that. I've moved to pretty rural America, out somewhere in the red zone. And it's interesting. I'll tell you why I'm optimistic, Adam, is that I think we need adversity to be strong. I'll just say it as simply as that. I think nothing could be worse for America as to have the trends we've now seen continue linearly into the indefinite future. That would truly be a nightmare scenario. You need these crises to turn things around. I think democracies are incredibly powerful when faced with these moments.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think democracies do very well in sort of unbroken prosperity and if not luxury, right? Simply moving from one decade to the next. I don't think democracies function very well in that environment, but I think democracies actually function very well in crises. And I to some extent, I think we need this. We need seasonality in history. Keeps us alive, keeps us active, keeps us interested in the world.
Well, thanks. Well, very well said. And, for those of us that have children and want our progeny to do well, we just as anyone who's raised a child knows that the child has to learn how to deal with adversity to become a self-sufficient, resilient adult. We want that kind of future for our kids and our grandchildren and their progeny as well. And so, yes, let's embrace the seasons.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, in wrapping up here, folks, if you wish that this conversation had gone on for 2 or 3 more hours like I did, please let Neil know you'd like him to come back on this channel as soon as the schedule allows by hitting the like button, then clicking on the red subscribe button below, as well as that little bell icon right next to it. If you are trying to figure out how to navigate this very rocky fourth turning road ahead that Neil has laid out for us and would like some help from a professional financial advisor in doing so, then feel free to schedule a free consultation with one of the financial advisors endorsed by Thoughtful Money. These are the firms you see on this channel with me every week. To do that, just go to thoughtfulmoney.com, fill out the short form there. The firm will be in touch with you right after. Lastly, just want to remind everybody that the Thoughtful Money Fall Conference is approaching Saturday, October 19th. And if you cannot watch live the day of the conference, everybody who registers will be sent replay videos of the full event within 24 hours or less. Afterwards, a phenomenal lineup, as you've heard me describe in the past, so I won't do it again here. But if you want to learn more about that lineup and get your tickets at the current lowest early bird discount price, go to thoughtfulmoney.com/conference. And a reminder that if you're a premium subscriber to our Substack, you get an additional $50 off of that ticket price. Neil, it has just been, again, a complete honor and privilege to have you on here. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for having me.
All right, everybody else, thanks so much for watching.